Driving is easily the most boring part of my job. I work as a salesman for an all-in-one printer company. Business has been slow the last couple of years, with the rise of personal printers, but our loyal customer base has really helped us get through these troubling times. That's why I was in Garrison and Marco's attorney at law that day. I'd been trying to sell them on the latest color all-in-one model to replace their current one, which was a few years old. They had sent me back to the office with a will think about it, and I had started my 4-hour drive back to said office. That's how I came to be on the highway behind the truck in the first place. The sun was setting when I left the law firm. By the time I got on the highway, it was already dark. I mingled with the other cars as we merged in with the big rigs that made the interstate their home. I was behind a particularly large 18-wheeler when I first noticed the thing. It started out as a reflection. Have you ever noticed how an animal's eyes will reflect the light? Well, it was like that. I was sitting behind him with my low beams on when I noticed the sparkle from underneath the trailer. It was 3 or 4 small reflective points, and in my mind, I sort of obsessed over it. What could possibly be making those reflections? Some sort of axle? Maybe something ornamental that the driver had stuck under this truck. It probably seems silly to obsess over something like that, as you sit reading my story. But when you're stuck in traffic on the interstate, your mind searches for all sorts of things to occupy your time. Whatever it was midway between the front wheels and the back wheels, too far into the truck for me to really make it out. I didn't think it was alive or anything, but it was a fun little mystery. I was stuck in gridlock. Some wreck up the way had brought us to a halt, and as I adjusted the radio in the beat-up old car that gave the salesman a drive, I found my eyes returning to that thing again and again. My brain just wouldn't leave it alone, and I began to create reasons for the thing to be under there. Maybe it was for stability. Maybe it was something he had put under there so people didn't hit the back of the trailer in the middle of the night. Maybe it was just one of those stupid things that people often hook to their trucks just because they can. Whatever it was, my mind had decided to obsess over it. I was watching it when my cell phone rang, and as I fished it out of my pocket, I found my eyes rising to see the thing as I said hello. "So, can we go ahead and put them down for a new printer?" the boss asked. They said they'd have to think about it, but they also said there's nothing wrong with their current printer, so I wouldn't expect to see any orders from them. Damn, I was really counting on offloading a couple of these to the firm. Did you tell them about the added features? Of course I did, sir. And I was about to tell him that I was no rookie salesman when I looked up and almost dropped the phone. The thing I had been focused on for the last 20 miles had moved. It was subtle, but when you've been staring at it for as long as I had, you notice these things. The thin fiber filament had shifted somehow, and the pattern had changed. I was almost sure of it. I could hear my boss asking if I was still there, and I assured him that I was. I told him I would be back in the office in a few hours, and he told me just to head home. I could turn in my reports tomorrow. Sounds like you could use the sleep. You're sounding a little jittery. I thanked him and told him I'd see him tomorrow, before hanging up the phone and looking back at the thing under the truck. I could also see 6 surfaces reflected back at me now, instead of the 4 I had seen a moment ago. They looked even more like eyes. Whatever wreck there was up ahead, they must have cleared it out of the way. We were suddenly moving along again at a brisk pace, and I was glad for the shift in speed. My mind had suddenly turned what looked like some kind of ornament into something dangerous, and I really wanted to be from behind this truck. There was no chance of getting around them, though. The traffic was still pretty tight, and I was pretty well trapped behind this 18-wheeler and the 18-wheeler beside me. So for the next 2 hours we drove, the most nerve-wracking 2 hours of my life. The longer we drove, the more I was convinced that it was no optical illusion. Whatever was under there was definitely moving, and it had quite a few legs that I could see. It was using 2 of the thinner ones to hold itself under the truck, and the other 6 or 8, or maybe even as many as 10, were anchoring it to the truck itself. What was worse were all those reflective surfaces that I still thought of as eyes. They were staring straight at me the whole time, and I began to believe that it knew I could see it. I shook my head the first time I thought this. I was tired, I had had too much coffee, and I was just seeing things. These were the excuses that ran around and around inside my head, like a dog chasing his tail. I didn't want to believe that I was stuck behind a truck, carrying a very different sort of cargo. I wanted to believe that I was just seeing things, and I was making things up to pass the time. That sort of delusion only lasted until the thing moved closer. You see, the longer I watched it, the longer it watched me. I don't know if it knew I could see it, but it didn't seem to like the level of scrutiny I was giving it. It was midway between the cab, watching me like a predator watching its prey. The longer it went on, the less safe I felt inside my car. Something that big could surely get through the window, or break the windshield, and I would have nowhere to go in this gridlock. But I was still trying to be rational, trying to be realistic. There was no way that whatever it was alive. It was a trick of the light. It was my mind playing tricks on me. When I finally got home, safe behind the door of my apartment, I would laugh about how silly I had been, and feel really stupid. I was a grown man behind the wheel of a car, jumping at shadows. I began to use this idea as a security blanket, wrapping myself in it so I didn't just go crazy right there behind the wheel of my car. That was when it moved. The reflective eyes shifted suddenly. I don't mean that they blinked or anything. I mean they shifted. One minute I was looking at it, and the next it was sliding beneath the underside of the trailer. Suddenly those eyes were coming closer. They were less than 10 feet away from my car now, peering from under the trailer at me as I tried to maintain my speed. I know how that sounds, but it's the truth. Whatever it was had finally gotten tired of being watched, and had decided to get closer. I felt a sudden stirring of primal fear. This must have been how early man had felt when it encountered something it just didn't understand, when it saw the long teeth and heard the growl of some unknown predator, when it saw the all too intelligent eyes of an animal that was a little too human reflected in the darkness, when it came to realize that the safety of its cave could also be a trap. I imagine that it felt just as helpless as I did now. Helpless, but intent on survival. I tried again to convince myself that I was being silly. This was nothing more than a trick of the light, some errant spiderweb under the cab that my headlights were catching that just now came loose and was presenting itself as some sort of boogeyman for me to be afraid of. I suddenly knew how to alleviate this fear. I would flip my high beams on. The high beams would show me the underside of the truck, and I could see that the source of my fears was nothing at all. I reached for the switch, my hands much less steady than I thought they should be, my fingers wrapping around the knob. For a moment, I just couldn't bring myself to turn the switch. Did I really want to know? Did I really want this thing to know that I knew? Once the monster in the closet knows that you know it's there, does it have any choice but to eat you? I shook my head and flipped the switch on. I know now that I shouldn't have done that. What was under the cab was no spider web, but it was the monster I had feared it was. It was a spider the size of a large dog. It was easily 4.5 feet tall, and it was hunkered beneath the trailer's cluster of wheels. It looked at me upside down, with its legs clinging to the metal, its fangs dripping some translucent liquid and clicking together very fast. It made a high, angry sound that I could hear from behind my closed windows, and the look it gave me on its far too expressive face was terrifying. My brain seemed to give me a choice between fight or flight, and in my cowardice, I chose flight. I pulled around the truck, pulling onto the soft shoulder of the road, and drove around it and the line of angry cars. Fortunately, there were no police officers in that line. There was an exit ramp not too terribly far from the truck, and I whipped into the on-ramp and pulled away from the highway into the small gas station about a mile later. It took me nearly 30 minutes to make my breath regular, expecting that spider creature to attack my car any minute. When I had control of myself again, I drove home. It took an extra hour, but I took side roads and backways the whole way. So often in these stories, there's a moment of horror that comes afterward. Some accident, a truck found abandoned on the side of the road, a dead body in the truck stop, but there was none of that for me. I never heard a news report alluding to anything strange or out of the ordinary. I could almost forget about it until I close my eyes and see those far too expressive eyes looking at me as the high beams pin it to the underside and their lights. I take back roads whenever I travel now, avoiding the highway at all costs. I avoid big rigs as well. I don't ever want to see anything like that again. Good evening, everyone. It's me, Dr. Plague. Thank you so much for joining me for tonight's story. Let's go ahead and thank our sponsors before we go. Thanks to Leslie Lou Riddle for being our Spooky Skeleton tier contributor. Thanks, Leslie. We just couldn't do it without you. And thanks to Glenn Jenkins for being our Ghost Rider tier contributor. Thanks, Glenn. We just couldn't do it without you. If you too would like to have your name read out at the end of every TikTok and every YouTube video that I do, come on down to Patreon and join our Spooky Skeleton Army. For just $5 a month, you too can be with Leslie Lou Riddle in my Spooky Skeleton Army. Or, if you're looking for some commission work, join Glenn Jenkins in my Ghost Rider tier commissions. I do custom horror pieces for interested parties, so come on down. My prices are very reasonable. If you'd like to get yourself a book, I recommend Dark Vortex. That's what we're reading on Wednesdays, so might as well get yourself a copy and read along with us. It'll be like a little book club. And as always, thanks for stopping by. Dr. Plague, signing off. Have a wonderful evening.